Hi, everyone. I get introduced by my former title instead of my moonlighting, daylighting title working for the state pension fund these days. Thanks for having us here and for having me here and letting me kind of talk to these friends over here, get to hear what their world is like these days. Don't give me any gifts because I have a Form 700 filing I'd have to do then. I've learned that these days, and I don't want a pesky reporter looking at my Form 700. Yeah, thank you. Is that an FPPC joke, Catherine?
So quickly you forget.
How quickly I forget. Sophia Bolag, politics reporter at the San Francisco Chronicle, who has been covering state government for a while. The Chronicle, the Bee, worked with me at the Times for a while. Ins and outs of the place. Ashley Zavala from KCRA, who, if you see her coming, apparently according to Capital Weekly, you run the other direction because she's got a tough question for you. And the one and only Dan Walters, who, yeah, what do you want your introduction to be here? Well, yes. Man who's been there and is still there, Dan Walters. So I think this is kind of a discussion that kind of pivots out of the first one, where you've talked about the economy in California, you've talked about the challenges, the unique nature of it. I heard Gabe Pettick talking about budget structure a minute ago, so I'm going to kind of use the budget as the kickoff part here. So tell me, friends, that I used to be on the budget beat, what is the big story? What is this year's dynamic all in one story, one thing? What are you looking at right now? Dan's got 7, so you got to pick one.
Well, it's the size of the
Oh yeah, you got to use your microphone.
It's the size of the deficit. You know, is it $38 billion like the governor says, or $73 billion like Gabe Pettick says, or somewhere in between? And as I mentioned in a column this week, everybody's watching that daily tracker of revenue coming into the state controller's office, and because that will be the basis, basically, of whatever is decided to be the deficit. And the thing about it is that there is no number that you can prove to be correct. So eventually the governor and the legislature will pick a number and they'll say, that's the deficit. And then they'll do whatever they need to do to paper it over in some way for the end of the fiscal year. But is that really the deficit, or is it not the deficit? We don't know. And that's the essence of the whole thing, really. We know there's a deficit. The question is, how big is it? Is it small enough to be manageable or large enough to be catastrophic? And nobody really knows.
Ashley, what's the topic that keeps popping up in your head this season?
Certainly the discrepancy in the numbers is a story, but for us, in our audience, I feel like we have to say what exactly this means for taxpayers in California. So what does this deficit, whether it's 78 billion or 30 whatever billion, what does that mean for homelessness funding? What does that mean for climate programs? What does that mean for the state's safety net services that the state has enjoyed great budget years within the last decade or so, and how will all of those be impacted, and how will taxpayers be impacted by all of this?
Sophia, what do you think?
Yeah, and I think, you guys kind of stole my answers, but moving forward, I think also looking at how the economy continues to do we continue to have big deficits, because that would create an even harder problem in the future. Newsom and the legislature do plan to tap into the rainy day fund to some extent this year, and so that means there will be less left over in that account if there are future deficits. So I think we don't know yet what that's going to look like, but that's, I would say, also a big factor as we're covering this budget year.
Where do any of you think, in every budget cycle I spent time watching too, but in every budget cycle there are a number of conflicts, but there are key conflicts that really kind of set up the tone. Cocktail hour will be test 2 versus test 3 on Prop 98. But it's not necessarily, it's not education this year, but what is, right, that's just as a bad joke. Thank you for the dad joke laugh. What is the conflict point that you see most often? There's health and human services, there are fundamental local state government responsibilities, but where is the conflict point so far at this point, do you think, that has to be resolved to get this thing done?
Well, so already in early action, we're seeing the sticking point was homelessness funding, which the Assembly was not ready to cut, but the governor and the state Senate was ready to do. And And with, we have all these locals and the big city mayors asking for ongoing funding that the state does not appear ready to commit to. And that certainly appears to be one of the sticking points this year. But in previous years, I mean, we've seen budget trailer bills and action in that way that ends up being some of the sticking points in those final negotiations. And we really don't know yet what exactly those are. So.
Any others?
Yeah, I think you go back to the size of the deficit, because the size of the deficit will dictate what they do about it. And therefore, the effect on specific programs and services will be determined by really what number they pluck out of the cosmos to decide this is the deficit we're going to deal with. And until you have that number, and the governor will put out a new number in a few weeks, then you really have to get into all the other things you have to deal with that number until you have the number. And I think that is a conflict. That is a conflict right there. I mean, if you read, you really get into the details of how the administration chooses the number it chose, and how the alleged analyst chose the number he chose. There are some fundamental differences there, mostly having to do with revenue. I mean, the analyst says that the governor's off by $24 billion on the revenue side. And that's a lot of money in anybody's book.
Is there a policy place that where activist policy watchers are beating down your door or poking you all the time to watch?
I mean, I would say in addition to homelessness, I'm also really curious to see what happens with some of the transit funding. I don't know if that will be a big fight, particularly because Scott Wiener is one of the budget chairs. That's been one of his pet issues. But especially in the Bay Area for our audience, like, that's a huge deal. If BART goes off the fiscal cliff, that would be a big problem for anybody who lives in the Bay Area. And also climate change funding. Some of the cuts that we already have seen are in the sort of climate space. And that's something where you have a lot of groups who really don't want to see reductions. They would say that, we're already, from their perspective, behind on fighting climate change. And, I think with a lot of these areas where you're, potentially going to see cuts, they've been areas where Democrats who run the government here have been really touting all the spending that they've been doing. And so it's going to be, tricky for them to continue saying they're, leading the charge on climate policy or on strengthening the social safety net if they're then having to cut from those programs. So
let me come back to climate in a minute, because there's an important political element I want to talk about. But I want to come back, since Dan is the man with the number point. And I think you make a very good point about, the number is at the center of so much of the discussion. You're the guy who I can totally ask this question to. I used to feel like I was sort of that guy, but I wasn't ever the guy like Dan's the guy. Like, the budget process itself has changed so much. And I would argue in the last 25 years, certainly longer than that, it has changed in one fundamental way that I think makes this tough. And this is the part I was going to ask you to just kind of opine on for a moment. We used to talk about budget years as a budget year, as a fiscal year, as a 12-month period. Part of when we get to these deficit discussions, we talk about the budget year prior, the current year, and then the budget year. Then we talk about a 3-year forecast. And so we start moving the number around. Where is the deficit? Which fiscal year is it in? Where do the revenues come in? Mm-hmm. And it makes for a lot of confusion, I would argue. First of all, it makes confusion in that building over there, but it makes confusion, I would argue, for Californians in trying to understand what's actually at
yeah, and that is part of the thing, because part of figuring out what the deficit is actually going back as much as 3 years, because there's stuff that has passed in previous budgets 2 years ago at least, in which is still at issue in as possible, quote, solution, unquote, to the current problem. So you have to go back and you have to go forward. And so you're really talking about at least a 3-year window, and maybe as much as a 4-year window, to discuss what the situation is, because the budgets don't begin on July 1 and end on June 30th. The stuff is in the pipeline, and you have to deal with that as well. And if you actually look at this, is supposed to be an economic futures forum. If you look ahead, both the governor and the analyst are in agreement that the state faces serious deficits, $30 billion a year in that area, for the rest of Gavin Newsom's governorship. So they're not only deciding what they're going to do about this budget by June 15th, but implicitly they're also deciding what's going to be carried over. And I'll give you a great example. My favorite little gimmick they're using into the governor's budget, the July 2025 state payroll.
I wrote a story about this.
Yeah, well, it's happened before.
Did I steal it from you?
No, it's happened before.
I know it has. I know it
The
has.
July 2025 state payroll would be paid to the employees in June of 2025, but it wouldn't be credited into the books or debited into the books until one day later on July 1st, so it would fall into a new fiscal year. So that's illustrates the fact that what they decide to do in this budget will also impact what the deficits are going forward. And part of that is trying to estimate revenues going forward. Now, why are we in this thing? We're in this thing because we had a one-year surge in revenues that some idiots decided was going to be permanent. And so they went out and, $97.5 billion. Governor Brown, the biggest deficit in the world, that sort of thing. Or biggest surplus in the world. They went out and spent that money doing all sorts of things that the legislature wanted to do, expanding Medi-Cal, expanding pre-kindergarten services, and so on and so forth. And then suddenly, hey, that money never showed up. Now we're stuck with it. What are we going to do?
Let me ask you something. And by the way, this is my favorite point where the other journalists on the panel, here Dan gets to call people idiots. They're like, yeah, I never did say that.
I'm a columnist. I can
Yeah,
call
exactly.
people
It's the
idiots.
columnist versus the straight news side of the business. But let me ask you a follow on something quickly before I go back to the politics stuff here. One of my favorite sources back in the day, the great Fred Silva. How many of you know Fred Silva?
Fred Silva, that's right.
Fred Silva through his legislative staffing times, PPIC, Cal Forward. Fred and I got into this, because I'm just a dork about the budget, but Fred and I got into this conversation one time about why we only do a real economic forecast, the fallacy of doing one at one particular time, late in the fall, that crafts the January budget. We don't go back and look at necessarily the economic underlying and stop it. We don't have a dynamic system for a very dynamic state and its economy. And it talked about why can't we rethink that? Of course, that was one of those ideas that comes out of a think tank.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying here, though? But
Yeah.
so much is built on an assumption that is months old by the time the budget is crafted.
And this is a good example. They finalized the budget in December, basically. All the revenue forecasts, all the spending and everything in December, based on this little mystery thing they go through on deciding what the economy is going to do and how much money it's going to produce. And John is absolutely right. They don't really revise that. What they do is they revise it based on what's happened to the revenue between December and May. And big changes this year, by the way. So they look at the revenue side, but they don't look at the underlying economic conditions. And it's a valid argument that it should be done. By the way, Fred Silva was part of a troika. The other two, who used to go into Capitol Park, eat their lunches, bag lunches, and make all the fiscal and tax policy for the entire state, sitting on the benches in the Capitol Park.
Doesn't Chris Woods do that still? Oh, is he here yet? Too soon? Okay. All right, let me go back to the climate topic, but in particular into the campaign season looking ahead. There's a lot of discussion about a climate bond. There have been other bond proposal ideas. What was the bare scintilla of a fingernail win in March for the bond measure there? I can't quite figure out what to call it. My writing skills are off today.
Paper
Sorry.
thin.
Paper thin. Well, that's hackneyed. I want something new. Anyway, what do you assess? What are you hearing about the nervousness of the electorate in trying to get involved? Because fundamentally, any of that is part of a budget issue and a budget conversation with voters.
Yeah, I mean, there's limitations to how much they can put on the ballot and what they can ask voters for. And I think, we just recently, 2 weeks ago, asked the speaker about this, and he really kind of gave us a non-answer that, we know that there are limits to what we can do, and we're assessing what's the best. But yeah, everyone, not just climate, but there's other bonds potentially in the works, and that's, yeah, I mean, I know we're going to get into the opaqueness of some of these discussions, but we're not really getting a lot of daylight here on what could be.
Yeah, sure. Also remember that the last school bond placed on the ballot was defeated.
Right.
And that was a kind of an advanced warning of, hey, we may be testing the limits of the voters' willingness to pass these bonds. And there is another school bond in the work, presumably, and so it's a legitimate question. I mean, it's not only what the voters will tolerate, but it's also what the financial markets will tolerate.
Right. But climate is such a unique issue, and you had brought it up, Sophia, and I just wanted to kind of poke back at it for a moment, because baked into a lot of the budget discussions are where you get the money, right? We've got the cap and trade money that has been used for things. There's the pushing off of things out of the general fund into special funds, obviously, which is part of that.
Yeah.
But there's a very palpable interest, and there's a very compelling argument that a lot of members are making. I mean, whether it's unpredictable climate cycles and everything we're living on in the state, wildfires and floods in one particular place. So I'm just curious, do you think that there's optimism that people still get that, or does everything get sucked down into the morass of a multi-billion-dollar budget deficit, can't do anything now, voters are angry, frustrated, pick your title?
I mean, I do think, I don't know if I have like a perfect answer to that question, but I will say about the electorate in November, because, you know, Dan, you're absolutely right about that last school bond, but I would note it was also in a primary, just like Prop 1. And, you know, primary electorates do tend to be older and more conservative. And so I do, you know, whether that means, what exactly that means numerically for potential climate bonds chances, I don't know. But I do think that if you have a younger electorate, younger voters do tend to be more concerned about climate issues. And so I don't know that I feel like I'm able to, you know, really predict what voters will do and how that'll factor into the legislature's decisions. Sorry, that's a deeply unsatisfying answer.
No, but you have hit on a very important point, which is that electorates change.
Yeah.
And it's the electorate that shows up that has the conversation. And our November electorates tend to be larger, more socially liberal, perhaps economically liberal, maybe not, depending on where we are. So it's a good point.
I would say from the results of Proposition 1 and the discussion around it, I am getting this sense that there is a mistrust overall with the state and the administration's ability to execute on its goals for a lot of this money. You know, leading up to Prop 1, we heard about, Cal Matters did a whole report on another ballot initiative that was brought to voters, sort of similar in terms of providing more units and housing, and it only yielded like pretty much nothing. I mean, some 12,000, I can't remember the actual number, but yeah, I think there is some inherent questions about the ability for our leaders to execute on the spending of this money.
And I think there's another element to this too, because we're looking ahead towards chronic deficits, at least for the next several years. This bond thing is part of a kind of
Into the mic a little bit more.
that since we are looking ahead at budget deficits, multi-billion-dollar deficits in the years ahead, part of this bond thing is, look, we're not going to have a lot of revenue to do things we want to do. Maybe we can shift it all into some borrowed money and keep the ball rolling with borrowed money. And so it is looking ahead in a way and saying, you know, this is going to be tight for a long time. It's not just 1 year. And it could be very tight. It could be even tighter than it looks. So maybe if we could get some bond money, we can kind of get a head start on some of this stuff and not have to worry about the revenues coming in later on.
Let me ask about a topic that I know people are talking about that has a economic component, social component, a moral component. It's homelessness. And it did kind of come up a moment ago. And funding for those programs, accountability for those programs. And the governor's been pretty tough on some of his local government partners of late. And I'm just curious, has the tide turned on this conversation in a way? Is it pitting people against each other? Is that the wrong assessment? This is cocktail chatter. I got a few ideas, but later for another time. But like, where do you think this issue stands? Because we look at polling, it is first and foremost on the mind.
It's right up there on top. And
Ashley, take a stab at that, and then I'll go to Sophia and then Dan.
Yeah, so we are definitely seeing this governor getting a lot louder about the local inability to track funding, not just track funding, but then also I know a lot of counties have held off on implementing SB 43. the conservatorship reform, they want to hold off, which he feels like is a big piece of his whole mental health, behavioral health structure reform that he's trying to accomplish. And so he's been a lot more vocal about locals not holding up their end of the bargain. And that really started, I would say, it's almost been 2 years since he withheld HAP funding from these counties because their plans weren't sufficient enough in the administration's eyes. So, but at the same time, I mean, the question is, to what extent does the administration take responsibility for it not checking in and tracking the $20+ billion that it decided to invest in this whole issue?
Yeah, I mean, as I was writing about Newsom's latest proposal to like increase accountability, which was last week?
Yeah.
The weeks all blend together. But it was striking because it was writing a very similar story to what I had written 2 years before. And so, to not give the Newsom administration credit for, the actions that they have taken, but homelessness is still really bad. I mean, I remember talking with Mayor Steinberg here in Sacramento, during all those discussions about withholding the homeless funding. This is end of 2022, I believe. And, Sacramento committed to a higher target of reducing homelessness, and just walking around downtown here, I mean, I think you can see that the problem is still really bad. And so, there's definitely, I think you used the word, he's been louder about this. Yeah. And I think the volume is growing, and we'll see if the results follow, because he's definitely under increasing pressure, as is every other elected official here in California.
I think if you look at maybe a little more jaundiced view of this thing, here's the situation. Gavin Newsom's got 2.5 more years in the governorship. The chances that the homelessness problem is going to be diminished in any meaningful way by then is zilch. It's going to still be there when he leaves the governorship. I think that he's in the process of trying to blame shift. You remember, this is the guy who declared himself to be the czar of homelessness at one time. And this is also his latest blast on the locals comes just a few days after the state auditor ripped them apart for the state's lack of oversight of their homelessness program, saying they didn't know what they were doing, have no data, they can't account for anything. So it's a little strange that he's now saying, well, it's the locals' problem. And it's finally, the locals have some pretty good arguments. They're saying, how do you expect us to have ongoing, fruitful programs if you only give us money 1 year at a time? We can't engage, we can't hire staff, set up facilities for a long-term thing if you're only going to give us the money 1 year at a time. And they all complain about, of course, that appellate court decision that says you can't clear off homelessness unless you have other means. And the locals have no necessarily any way of offsetting that by actually providing the housing that would allow them to clear the encampments. So I think there's a lot of blame shifting going on here in anticipation that this problem it has gotten worse despite the spending $24 billion, and is likely to not get any better, and perhaps will continue to get worse on into the future. And some people are going to be held accountable for that politically, if nothing else, including Gavin Newsom. If he has ambitions beyond the governorship, that's going to be an albatross around his neck, probably.
How much of this, though, of this topic has supplanted the topic it's connected to, which is housing? Because obviously as I said, there's an obvious clear connection, but housing is housing has been lingering around, and housing was our buzzword for several years until we started talking about this particular part of it. Is it the same frustration? Has it supplanted it in the voters' minds, do we think? Is it, I'm just fascinated by both the connection and the lack of connection in the two conversations.
Just like homelessness, we're also seeing some blame happening in that space in the form of lawsuits against name the jurisdiction, Huntington Beach. I mean, I feel like we're still seeing this scolding from the state to locals that aren't doing enough in both of these spaces. But again, to what extent does the responsibility fall on the administration and just the leadership overall? Considering that this governor did set a goal of what, like 3.5 million homes when he made his pitch to voters, and he's called that a stretch goal ever since, and now has really dwindled that number, the goal, to I think it was like 250,000 new units at last check. And so I think they're very much connected, and the approach is very much the same.
And you also have to remember about the housing situation is local governments can zone land, they can change their design criteria, can do all these things the state wants them to do, but that unto itself does not build housing. Ultimately, that housing situation in California depends on investment of many, many billions of dollars by the private economy. The state can't put that money up. It doesn't have that kind of money. Look, a unit of affordable housing in California costs a minimum of $500,000 to build. And they're in many localities, including San Francisco, where it costs $1 million a unit to build for affordable housing. The money does not stretch very far, and it's very difficult to get people to put money into those projects when the cost of doing it is extremely high. So you can do all the things you want to do about Huntington Beach, but in the end, that doesn't build any housing. It only creates supposedly a better climate for doing so, but it doesn't really get the money into the housing picture.
You look like you were going to say something.
Yeah, I do want to point out though that like when you talk about the discrepancies and particularly in San Francisco, and I don't know that you were saying that this isn't the case, but like it's local policies that determine a lot of those discrepancies, right? And one of the things that Newsom's housing unit did just do, and that I've got a close eye on, is the audit of San Francisco's planning process that just found, you know, it takes way longer. I think the number is 10 months longer in San Francisco than anywhere else to get something, you know, to I think even just the permitting stage, although I may have some of those details off, so I apologize. But, you know, I think there is some accountability on the local side in a lot of jurisdictions that does need, you know, if there's going to be more building, there have to be changes at the local level as well as the state level. So, you know, I just think there's been, none of this is new. You know, the first lawsuit against Huntington Beach was in 2019. And so, you know, it's not new that Newsom is sort of shifting blame to the locals and the locals are shifting blame to the state. But I don't know that we're really seeing a ton of progress on that front either. So,
all right, palate cleanser moment here for the press corps. This is a press corps internal conversation part here. Yes. What's the hardest part about the budget beat? Oh, God. I got my long list from years. Yeah, but they need to hear your version. What's the hardest part about the budget beat?
Getting answers.
Okay. How about it?
This is such, and especially, I'm gonna try to organize my thoughts here. So pre-pandemic, I would say it was a little easier to get some answers. And I say pre-pandemic because that's when the Capitol Annex was still up and running. The governor's office was not on a protected floor with a protected barrier and a security entrance that you need to get through in order for you to stake outside of the office. So
you're saying the grizzly bear was not a deterrent.
Yeah, bacteria bear was like out in the open and everyone could go up to it. And so reporters like us could sit outside knowing that Holly Mitchell and Phil Ting were in there, and we could just wait and get something. We get something. Just like, oh, here's what we're talking about. Here's a sticking point, blah, 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 blah. Ever since the Capitol Annex was demolished and everyone moved over to O Street, it's awful. And it has been. And I know Republicans lament that there's no longer the budget conference committees anymore. There's no, at least, open hearings to air out some of these discussions that are happening behind closed doors. But yeah, I mean, really, some of us are just relying on our sources inside the room or inside some of these talks to tell us what's going on. And, but yeah, overall, like even just 2 weeks ago, we had this situation where the governor, at least we could stake him out in the Capitol. And we tried to chase him down to get some answers. We really got nothing. But because after he did that, he sent this statement like, we have a deal, but they don't have a deal. And it was just we have a deal to have a deal at some point. And it's parsing through a lot of that. That's just right now, we're just in this place where just so many people in that building are still in this like pandemic hangover of interacting with journalists and providing information.
So you're making a pretty good case for access.
Yeah.
And I was going to ask also access and process. But tell me, what's the hardest part of the beat for you? And then Dan's going to tell me what's been the hardest part of the beat for the whole damn time. But anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Ashley just said. And I would also, Ashley and I are both like, we're the only state politics reporters in both of our, newsrooms. And that's really hard. And it's really difficult to, when I used to be at the Sacramento Bee, I was in a bigger bureau. And so I could watch all the budget committee hearings. I don't have time to watch all the budget committee hearings now, even though I think that to cover the budget well, you really need to do that. But I have to watch all the other hearings too. And so, that's also, it's sort of the flip side to it. When the access isn't good and it's harder to just get basic answers and it takes more time for that and we have less time, it's just a bad situation. So
Access, process, something else?
Yeah, I think that it's part of a trend, I think.
Bring the mic back up a little bit.
Oh, it's part of a trend that we've seen over the last 8 or 9 years of more and more stuff going behind closed doors. The budget used to be a big five thing, and the Republicans were involved, and they would come out and they'd talk and everything. Now the whole thing is done totally behind closed doors. They don't even go through the motions or the superficial motion of passing a budget and then passing a budget and trying to recognize. It's just simply all done, all at one fell swoop, behind closed doors, presented as a fait accompli.
Are you marking the Prop 25 era after the supermajority budget versus the majority?
Yes, that's a lot of it. And also have, the supermajority and also the change in the law that basically aced the Republicans out of the participation. And it actually, if you actually go into history, it's back to the old days, way back in the 1950s and 60s when they used to do it all behind closed doors. Then they came out in the open, and now it's behind closed doors again. And compounding that is the proliferation of trailer bills. Trailer bills that are attached to the budget can be passed by a simple majority vote, cannot be referended, and very often
and take effect immediately.
Can take effect immediately and contain huge changes in public policy that have never had a hearing, never involved. It's something just sprung on everybody in the last minutes of the budget process, and nobody reads them, and everybody just votes for them because, hey, the leadership votes for it, they vote for it, and you find out later that they voted for something that was, and a good example of that is this so-called utility surcharge they were going to put on everybody based on income, and everybody said, where did this come from? Well, it came out of a budget trailer bill passed without any hearings or really notice several years ago. And so the budget, the use of the budget to do things that are not really connected to the budget as a vehicle for secretly or semi-secretly making policy is another aspect of this thing. This is part of a descent into secrecy in California state government that's been edging that way for a number of years.
And if it's a descent, it hasn't reached its destination
Oh,
yet?
no, probably not. But it's getting worse all the time.
And what's the
And this business
what could change the trajectory?
of being behind locked doors over here is just another aspect of it.
What could change the trajectory? I mean, I don't think any of you are going to stand out and say, "Well, we can in the press, by God."
No, we
sorry,
can't.
that's the downer part.
I think it's a direct outgrowth of having one-party government, basically, where they don't feel they need to deal with the press, don't need to take the account in the other party. They can do any damn thing they want to,
But is that
and there's
process
no penalty for
Well,
it.
Forgive me, is that process following the politics, though? I mean, the reality of elections in this state and kind of who wins and who
Yeah.
loses?
It is.
Go ahead, Ashley. I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
I mean, but I think I do think some of this does rely on us to know the process and understand it well, because with this utilities graduated income program, we had all these coastal area lawmakers organize this press conference to say how horrible it is, and here's this new proposal because we're going to fight this, and the utilities make so much money.
And they all voted for it.
And my first question was, you all voted for this. What changed? And everyone's like,
They didn't
well,
know they were,
we didn't read the bill.
they didn't know they
And it's
didn't
like-
know they were voting for it.
And so it's we sort of have to. And I know you mentioned my reputation of asking hard questions. It's not even that hard. I'm just following up. It's like the problem we have right now as a press corps also, and thank goodness you're still here. But we've lost, but I'm sad you're not.
Now I'm going to walk the other
But
way.
I'm sad you're not
Yeah.
because we don't have people who. It takes a long time to establish the knowledge and all the understanding to be able to come back and circle back with these people and call them out. I think it takes time to be able to do that. And we have a lot of new members of the press corps. A lot of people have been here for less than a year, maybe 2 years, or who came during the pandemic when things went so out of whack. And so it's just, that's also another challenge that we have right now. We are also so small, but we are, we're trying to be a little more unified in our approach to just calling some of this out. Yeah.
I mean, I think access and process they may be a particularly acute problems right now. They also are eternal problems to an extent. I mean, not minimizing what you're talking about. But one of the things that I am struck too is that from the original term limits era, even through the new term limits era, the legislature has evolved, changed, and Dan, you've seen most of this. I'm just curious though that, who are the people who lead the conversation now? Who are the electeds, or who are the outside people? Who are the people who understand the stakes and the larger picture? I can rattle off names from members past. Maybe the structure has just changed so much, to Dan's point about one party, that's a little harder. But who are those people? Who are those people that? Well, I'm gonna start with you, Dan. You're gonna sling arrows,
I'm not sure that there are any, to tell you the truth. I think that
headline.
The turnover.
No one gets it.
Film at 11. Turnover in the legislature because of term limits. One of the bad aspects of term limits, frankly, is the rapid turnover. But I think that my sense of the thing is that legislators, once upon a time, in the old days, were individuals with individual talents and many of them individual experts in certain topics. To me, it seems that the legislators have become interchangeable, that there's nobody really standing out, and there's an awful lot of groupthink that goes on and not much individuality. And I think that's a loss, and it has just a lot to do with the fact that you have a one-party government, and they don't have to do things that they would once had to do because there's no penalty for not doing them, and including being more candid with what's going on behind those closed doors.
I had a question. You go ahead.
Sure.
You had a point.
So I think the main, I think the main, to answer your question, it's Gavin Newsom and who he chooses, and that's who's in control. And I know in a typical lame duck governorship, there's really no power. The legislature can have a little more wiggle room in decision making, but this governor for the last 4 years has bragged about jamming his legislature, has done shoved budget trailer bills down their throats, and they complain about it, but they still let it happen, like on sequel reform last year. And then whatever else he decides to do. And I just feel like this legislature just falls down and lets him do whatever. And even on the fast food bill, for example, the governor led those negotiations, and the lawmaker who wrote the bill allegedly had nothing to do with it. We're just allowing the governor and his office to mediate these discussions and keep lawmakers out of it. So what is the point of the legislature is really my latest question. But
all right. Sina, that's it. You wanted provocative at lunch, we give it to you. Let me talk though, if we're not looking at the upper house, lower house in old person parlance, or third house or fourth estate, we look outside of that at the interest group universe that influences what happens in politics, in the Capitol, and by extension, the economy, and what happens in California. Where's who are the interest groups that you're looking
Unions.
for? Well, okay, there's a standard, management, employer, union, business part here.
Yeah.
Talk about that part if you want, but
Well,
talk about where you see that interest group influence or power, or how much there is. Who has the ear of the people, governor and others, who are making decisions?
I think that since Lorena Gonzalez became head of the Labor Federation in California, that the labor has become, they were already powerful, they become even more so with a much more ambitious agenda than they had before, and putting a lot of muscle behind their agenda. And it's a more vigorous or more aggressive advocacy than we have seen in the past, and it's paying off for them. That the fast food bill being one example, and they're driving. You look at the bills that are introduced today and are going through committees this week. There's a lot of labor agenda bills going through. I mean, unemployment insurance for strikers is back, for example. That's like number one for the labor movement, and they're back for another try at that. There's a lot of stuff. I think and in all fairness, many of the members of the legislature come out of unions. They're union people themselves, their families are in unions, and the unions tap them on the shoulder and say, vote, run, and we'll support you.
Is it just that dynamic, or are there other interest groups out there? One of my mentors in journalism used to say, we never call them special interests because everybody thinks they're a special interest. So I never called them that in what I wrote. But are there other interest groups that and you can piggyback on that or other ones, but I'm curious, where do you see that dynamic and who's got the ear of who here?
I mean, on the topic of Newsom being so powerful, which I think is true, he really is a particularly powerful governor in relation to this legislature. I mean, the tech industry, there are a lot of people in the tech industry who do have his ear. He listens to them. And they're also a very powerful lobbying force at the Capitol, particularly right now as we're seeing all these AI bills going through. And so that's another big interest group in addition to the unions, which are they have been powerful for a long time. And I think you're right that with Loretta Gonzalez, coming on to lead them, they've gotten even more powerful. But I've been keeping my eye on tech influence as well, because I think that's another.
And that's an important part of the economic conversation, since we're at an economic conference.
Absolutely,
here.
yeah.
I mean, you've talked about AI. You want to elaborate on any of that, of where you think these topics are?
Well, I think that California is in this, and the U.S. writ large, but California particularly, we're in this interesting sort of competition with China over electric vehicles and and on AI. But I think particularly on the electric vehicle front, I'm really fascinated by what's going on with Tesla. I covered the governor's trip to China last year, and we toured that Tesla gigafactory in Shanghai. And it's wild to see the layoffs this week, that Tesla has announced, because it's incredible how quickly they've, ramped up that industry. And so I think that that's also top of mind for Newsom. And it relates into the climate goals too, right? Especially when you're talking about AVs. California, I think the leaders here really want to lead on this green economy transition. And I think that is something that they're all thinking about. So I don't know how satisfying of an answer that was,
good.
but
Good. I mean, these are some of the the dynamic factors at play, and I think the traditional labor business one obviously is important. But I was looking to see if there are other ones as well. I think tech is a really good example of that. Any others come to mind? I mean, are there others that have any clout, any juice that you would flag here?
I mean, I would honestly, I would say those feel like the two big ones right now. I feel like business screams from the top of their lungs, and I don't know that they're heard nearly as much as these other two. And I do feel like tech also being as rich and wealthy and able to fight whatever shenanigans or whatever they might perceive as shenanigans is thrown at them. They have the ability to fight these things. I mean, look at Google, for example, which tried to block some news organization links in California because of the Journalism Preservation Act by Buffy Wicks. These are groups that are, I think, influential and have to have the governor's ear or leadership's ear, because they're powerful enough and they're rich enough to fight whatever they have.
Let me offer another thing. Over the last couple of decades, business has been very successful, really overall, in blunting what they consider to be, the famous job killer list, for example. Very successful. But I think they believe with some degree that they're losing that edge slowly because the other side, mostly the unions under Lorena Gonzalez and so forth, have become very much more aggressive. So I think we're seeing a shift in tactics of business from working the legislature per se, although they'll continue to do that, to going outside the legislature and using the ballot as a way of protecting themselves from what they consider to be the excesses of the legislature. And we've seen that on things like the fast food bill, where they were going to put a measure on the ballot and forced a compromise, basically, that they found to be palatable. The fight over that thing was never over the $20 an hour. The fight was over preserving the franchise model. And they preserved the franchise model, and they were happy with that. But you're seeing it this year with the ballot measure, for example, that would really put the hammer on tax increases in California. This is one of, they say in the mafia, they're going to the mattresses, on this thing, both sides, because this is fundamental. This is where they both live, and they're going to say, and you're seeing this going to the ballot, forcing the issue, maybe forcing a compromise like in the fast food thing, or going ahead and fighting the battle. But I think they're moving outside of the legislative process, which they believe now is stacked against them, given the supermajorities in the legislature. So they're going to wage it in the public. You're seeing another one in the business measure to change the Private Attorney General's Act, PAGA. That's another one, that's a big one for both sides, and they're going to go to the mattresses on that one as well. And this is part of this trend. And I think you're going to see more and more business-sponsored ballot measures in California to try to counteract what's going on in the legislature. And it's an interesting new wrinkle in the whole picture that's been going on.
And we're seeing it with law enforcement, I would say, too. Criminal justice reform groups definitely also have the ear and the influence of the three big leaders, the Speaker, the Pro Tem, and the Governor, all who have come out to say they don't think Proposition 47 needs to be changed, or that we need to go back to the ballot on that. And with that, we have this whole coalition of people and law enforcement and Republicans and whatever else they've been labeled
Democratic
as.
mayors.
Democratic mayors who want to go to the ballot and submitted 900,000 signatures. So yeah, I mean, perhaps, yeah, like Dan mentioned, it looks like just people maybe have lost faith in the ability for the legislature to actually do anything or to hear them out.
That one is funded by businesses too.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, there's an old law of physics: for every action, there's a reaction, and it's very true in politics. And if one side gains an upper hand, the other side will try new tactics, and that's what's happening now. It's just changing the whole dynamic of how law is being made in California. It's being made in trailer bills, which is a new, relatively new wrinkle. And it's also being made in the ballot measures. But it's how things actually get enacted and what gets enacted. Now, there's a much more complicated process that involves stuff inside the Capitol and stuff outside the Capitol as well.
Well, I'm going to use physics and say that, like, even though we're a body in motion, at 1 o'clock we're going to be slammed into a break and stop, and you can do something else. Let me wrap this going back again inside the universe of being a journalist at this particular time. And Ashley, I'm going to start with you for a particular reason, because I had the good fortune to work in a variety of mediums: television, radio, newspapers. Television is a uniquely challenging medium for telling government, budget, economic stories. There's a complexity to the topics, and there's a need for clarity and conciseness. So talk to me a little bit about how you approach this job. There have not been a lot of people in your gig.
Yeah.
There was a particular time where I was the last TV reporter, and then there was nobody, and then people like you came back in. How do you approach this job? And then I want to amp it out to talk about just the challenges of this particular beat, because I do think, I'm going to be like, wearing my heart on my sleeve here. I think this is one of the hardest beats in journalism. I also think it's one of the most important beats in journalism.
I agree.
But start off with you.
Yeah.
And then we'll...
So first, I originally wanted to be the three of you and John, I know you've got your TV experience, but I wanted to be a writer, and I just had so much respect for the ability to cover process and provide details and context into the things that that are happening in our legislature and at the Capitol. But the issue with TV is, and this is traditional, and this is what I've tried to move away from, is like, oh, Billy Bob has blah, 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 a store on 10th Street, and we have to humanize, and we have to bring out the human, and the human is important. But lately, and with the support of my station and my bosses, we're trying to have more of a conversation. We're trying to dumb things down as much as possible so that our audience can understand what's going on. Like for the budget, for example, you know, this discrepancy in the number is a big issue and it has an impact. But instead of trying to like humanize it with someone, it's a conversation with the anchors who are just asking what voters would typically ask. What does this mean? So why does the governor have a different number? And so what cuts could be made? And we're trying to kind of move more in this conversational storytelling way, as opposed to just trying to like shove some humanistic story down people's throats. Because again, the process especially right now, as we've mentioned with the supermajority legislature, the opaqueness, the lack of access, we sort of have to explain the process, which has not been sexy, it's not visual, it's not anything, but it's important. So.
And I'm going to plug the three people here for a particular reason for a moment. One of the things that Ashley does very well when you watch what she puts on the air is it's explanatory. And I think that television does have the ability to be explanatory in a way that the written word, it's a little harder sometimes, no offense to the written word. Sophia, who I've had the great fortune to be around for a very long time, she was the most talented person who ever came through as an intern at the LA Times Capitol Bureau. I'd be damned if she didn't go work somewhere else. But that was not my fault. But tell me why you do this and why and what challenges you face in the job. They can be the industry, which is undergoing all of its challenges too, but they can also be the beat. I mean, how do you see it?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, I'll take the why I do this question. I mean, I think you're absolutely right that covering the budget is one of the hardest and most important beats. It's like arguably the biggest thing that they do. I feel like you said that to me first. You were the first person I had heard say that, you know, in terms of like stuff that happens in the building, the biggest thing is the budget. And if you just listen to the lawmakers and the governor talk about the budget, it's like all jargon, it's all spin, which I understand why they do that. You know, it's part of what they do. But it's really important that we come in and explain, like, what does this actually mean? You know, like the Senate keeps saying protect our progress. That doesn't mean anything to the average person. And so, like, what does that mean? Like, what is a non-spun way of, you know, actually describing what they've proposed and what they're supporting? I'm not trying to pick on the Senate, you know, like, but there's so much jargon that gets, you know, floated around. And I think cutting through that and getting to, you know, I mean, I think you're right that like it's particularly challenging in TV to, you know, simplify things to the point where someone can be listening to it, you know, in the background as they're cooking or whatever, or, you know, same with audio. But it's so important because people don't have time to take the time that we do to, you know, really understand this stuff. So I think it's really important. It's important that the public understands how the budget process works. And it's important that we dig into the weeds to get sort of to understand it well enough that we can simplify it for the average person. So
you get to bring it home. You know, one of the things when I first came to the Capitol in '96 and then came back in 2001, Dan was a clear voice. I remember Gray Davis getting into an argument with you in a press conference one time, but that's cocktail chatter. So if you want to stick around. Yeah, he did. Actually, he did. He said he didn't call you on you. He said, I didn't call on you, Governor. That was kind of, he was red-faced. It was the recall. It was a fun time.
It was a great time.
Your microphone. But Dan,
It was a great
Dan
time.
is singularly one of the most consequential voices in California political journalism history. And I'm curious as we wrap this up and give you this word, what keeps you doing it? What hope or fears do you have? And I'm talking, you can be budget or the process of the news business, but what keeps you coming back? Because you have consistently come back year after year.
Nothing else better to do, I guess. Or I'm in a rut. I started in this business in 1960, probably before most of you were ever born. And it's just something that I grabbed. I'll tell you what it really started with. I was an editor of the high school newspaper, and I wrote something that made the vice principal so mad he was ready to hit me. And I said to myself at the time, this is a lot of fun. And that was it. I was hooked, maybe, hooked. So, you know, it's just, I have nothing else better to do, actually, literally speaking.
Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future of the kind of work that you and our colleagues do?
Well, there's always a market for it. There's a market for information. There's a market for analysis and clarity and about government. The question is, how do you fill that market in a way that you can survive economically, which is the problem newspapers have particularly, and still be able to do it. And it's the news business is looking for new models, looking for new ways to do something that will be sustainable. You know, getting a tax break from the state of government, Buffy Weeks or whatever her name is, that's not going to save the newspaper business. And it has to be something else. I think newspapers, paper papers will disappear within a few years. I was shocked the other day to find out that the Los Angeles Times press run of paper papers now is 100,000.
Yeah.
And it was one time 1.1 million.
Right.
And so newspapers are increasingly relying on their online stuff, and they have to do that. And to make money at it is still a process and thing. We did it a different way. Cal Matters did it a different way. I quit the Bee after 33 years and went to work at Cal Matters in 2017. Still collect my pension from McClatchy, by the way. And when I went on board with Cal Matters, we were in that little office there on 925 L Street or whatever it is. You know,
that used to be my office. That was the KQED office.
And we were sharing it with KQED or something. I think I was like
number
10 on the payroll, and they had no place to put me, so I actually had to work from home. Now we have 70 people at Cal Matters. We just absorbed another website that deals with technology. We're going to have 26 more people onto the payroll here very soon. We're going to have basically 100 people on our payroll. So this thing is growing out of crazy. But we're still, somehow they're able to raise $12 million a year to keep us going all the time. It's nonprofit. It's like a public TV station or something. And it may be that we are the wave of the future. I don't know. But at least the whole idea of Cal Matters in the first place was to fill the hole that was caused by the decline of newspaper bureaus in the state capitol. And I think we've done that, and we continue to do it. It's been a very fascinating process for me to watch a different kind of organization not only grow, but invent itself as it goes along. And it's very, very interesting. And that's probably why I keep on doing it, because it's kind of interesting to watch all this happen. I'm kind of an insider who also looks at the thing from the outside, because I consider what I do to be my hobby. You know, I could have retired decades ago, but I just consider it my hobby, just like George Skelton.
Yep.
It's what he does. It's what I do, because we don't have to know how to do anything other than that. We're both widowers, so we can devote all the time we want to this business, and we just do it because we do it.
Well, and I'm glad you're doing it. I'm glad George is doing it. I'm glad Sophia and Ashley are doing it. And I would act like I don't miss the stakeouts, but a little part of me misses the budget stakeouts from time to time. Anyway, I know we're at the end of our time here. Yes? Did I hit the time mark? Or I'm off
perfectly.
Mark? Yeah, I know. You know, supposed to be a little TV guy looking at it. Anyway, thank you. Thanks for the conversation, you all, and thank you for having us. I really appreciate that.
Now we have some time for audience questions. So if you'd like to ask a question, please come on up to the front.
My apologies.
This microphone from folks on Zoom.
Speaking of a guy,
Speaking of a guy
I learned a lot from, A.G. Block. You want the microphone? You want me to go Oprah style to him? Let's do that. Oh, he's going over there? Ah, to hell with that.
We got a setup. Thank you all for getting your steps in.
AG Block, I was part of their group for 25 years in the Capitol, and part of the UC group here at UC Center for my last 10 years. This has been one of the most depressing conversations to hear you talk about what it's like to do your job. I think Lucas is still here. So, Greg,
Another person I
Greg Lucas and I and John to some degree, and certainly Dan, go back to a different era. So one of the challenges for your business, and I still consider myself as a freelancer, part of that, is to help engage a well-informed electorate. And so my question to you, you're in an incredibly shrunken press corps. Do you and your colleagues, do you feel you have the bandwidth to support that challenge? And do you think the electorate is paying attention to what you're writing? Now, I'm not talking about the insider group that lives here in Sacramento. I'm talking about the folks who live in the suburbs around where you cover. So do you think you have that bandwidth, and do you think you do the job?
Yeah, so in terms of bandwidth, I think there definitely need to be more reporters here in Sacramento. But absolutely, Chronicle readers are very interested in election coverage. That is some of the stuff that does the best on our website. We get the highest readership for it. I absolutely think people are like hungry for information about the issues that they are being asked to vote on. Particularly when it comes to, local measures, I think, but also state measures. Like, I think, ballot measures can be, oh my God, so complex. And a lot of readers really do come to newspapers still to understand those and like figure out what is this thing that I'm even supposed to be voting on. So, yeah, I mean, but I also think that like, to be sustainable, we have to figure out how to engage younger voters too, which I think is a real challenge. And so many people are getting news on like TikTok, and like it's often people don't seem to understand this, but like I was speaking with a friend of mine the other day, and we were talking about this New York Times investigation into like, is your car spying on you? I don't know if you guys saw that, but it's very good. And we were talking about the same thing, and I was like, oh yeah, and I was so impressed that the Times got this detail or whatever. And she didn't even know that it was the New York Times that had done that investigation, because she had just seen TikToks about it. And so the information was coming from real journalists, but like she didn't know that. And this is like a well-educated woman who actually does read the news and, is not like a teenager. Teenagers probably don't even understand that that's really where all the accurate kernels of information are coming from. So I don't have a solution for that, but I do think that's a challenge moving forward.
From the TV side, I would say that we actually, me as a person trying to cover everything, no, I do not have the bandwidth to do everything. But luckily, I will say that my TV station made the decision in 2022 to dedicate one person to cover the Capitol every single day, not every other day, not if we don't have breaking news, it's every single day. And because of that, they've given me a team of people to help me parse out some of these other stories that I can't cover, but that we absolutely want to get on air. And we are seeing this shift, especially in this market, where when I started in 2018, I was the Sacramento bureau reporter for KRON in San Francisco. I was the only television journalist dedicated to covering the Capitol every single day. Now there are 4 other TV stations, 3 in Sacramento and then 1 in Los Angeles, that have television reporters at the Capitol every single day. So there is this commitment from the TV side. Nexstar Media Group, for example, my last employer, has dedicated teams of journalists to covering state houses across the country. And we're seeing this shift, I think, in a lot of corporations that are, I know there was discussion about NBC News having somebody set up shop here. So there is in the TV world certainly an interest to make sure that the electorate is as informed as possible.
Reason Cal Matters got started about 8 years ago is that 2 women living in the Silicon Valley, friends, one Democrat, one Republican, got to talking about the decline of of Capitol coverage because his newspapers shut down. You know, it's hard to believe, but at one time, virtually every daily newspaper in California had somebody in the Capitol. We had people here from Chico and Santa Rosa and Ventura and Bakersfield and San Bernardino and Riverside and on and on and on, all gone. And that's what they were calling it. The newspapers in their economic throes were shutting down their Capitol bureaus as being expendable. And they said to themselves, well, we got to do something about that. So it's kind of like an old Judy Garland, Mickey Rooney movie. Let's put on a show. And so they contacted, or I'm not sure how the contact was made. They teamed up with Dave Lesher, who used to be an LA Times reporter, and they founded Cal Matters. And they got some seed money, and they started it with the idea of fundamentally of increasing the bandwidth, of increasing the coverage of the state capitol. And as I said, this has gone from virtually nothing. Laurel Rosenhall was their first hire of a journalist, came out of the Sacramento Bee Bureau. She's now the bureau chief for the LA Times. She replaced John over there. And I was like number 10 on the payroll. I had just got tired of the Bee and decided to quit. And I was going to retire. I was thinking about retiring. I said, well, let me go talk to Cal Matters. So, and that's how it got started. And it's been very successful. And we now have literally dozens of people covering politics and public policy in California. Not all just in the Capitol, but throughout the state, basically. And so maybe that's the way to expand the bandwidth. I mean, we have expanded the bandwidth, and we're continuing to hire, we're continuing to expand. And maybe that's the way, as long as our fundraisers can keep on somehow getting enough money to pay our checks, we'll continue doing what we do. And by the way, for those who are not, Cal Matters is absolutely free to anybody. We even give away our material to newspapers. They can use it free of charge. You can sign up for newsletters or check the website, or we have a daily briefing. I mean, we got so much product, we can't stand ourselves. And we're moving into television. We're moving into radio. We have a television studio in our new offices. We're doing TV. We're doing radio. We're doing podcasts. We're doing all this stuff with the idea that there is a market for information about governance in California, and we're going to try to fill that void.
Thank you all. We have time for one more audience question. Is there anyone? Please.
Thank you all for being here. Earlier in the conversation, you were talking a lot about the big issues on Californians' minds, homelessness, housing being the most important among those, and blame shifting around it. You mentioned local governments, the state government, but I'm wondering if you all think at all about where the federal government plays into this. From my perspective, I see not only increasing costs, but wages that haven't gone up. That's largely, I would imagine, due to federal policies, not states. Also, most affordable housing funding historically has trickled down from the federal government. Right now, there's very low investment from the federal government. So I'm wondering what your perspectives are on that and how you see the problems in California being influenced by the federal government.
I'll give it a whirl. I'll give it a whirl. Yes, you're absolutely right about that. It's very difficult to cover federal government from Sacramento. I mean, it's virtually impossible. So we're kind of dependent on actually the coverage coming from the larger publications who have people in Washington. We don't try to cover, we will cover something if there is that has a federal aspect to it, like homelessness, obviously, or housing and that sort of thing. But you're right. I mean, the federal government plays a role. One little piece of data that illustrate that: half of the medical care costs in California are paid for by the federal government. Half. Between Medi-Cal, Medicare, and federal employees and federal retirees and everything, they pay half of California's medical bill. So if you have any hope, as some people in the Capitol do, of having single-payer health care, they would have to persuade the federal government to end all those programs in California and give all the money to the state of California to do, which is one of the great impediments to single-payer health care. So yes, the federal government plays a huge role. The federal government played a huge role in propping up California's economy with aid during the pandemic, the loss of which is now the hangover of that is now being felt by the state budget, by schools and everybody else who got all that money. So yes, the federal government plays a big role, but it's a very difficult thing to single that out as an aspect of covering what goes on in California. It should be done, probably better than we do it, but it's a very difficult thing to do.
I was just going to, I'll tell you one thing, just in conclusion. I think the hand of the federal government, in my experience, has been very invisible in a lot of times, even though it is there. And I was going to say Dan's, and Dan beat me to it, but I'll give a different version. The single least understood story to me when I walked out of my press corps job too, and for the years, has been the remarkable success of the Affordable Care Act in California. Through expanding covered California, through 2 governors, through Brown and Newsom, the enormous consequences that has changed the dynamic of healthcare in this state, which is entirely a federal government thing, but it's largely hidden out of the way until something happens and the money's not there, in which case then there's a story. Yeah.
I mean, also from a reporter standpoint, since we cover state politics, we don't really have our state leaders who we are supposed to communicate with really saying any of this. Now, if they did, then yeah, I think we would certainly follow that road, but it's tough when they don't really place any blame on feds. Yeah.
Yeah. Good question. I think it's the shepherd's crook. I see it coming out.
Yes, it is. John, Dan, Ashley, Sophia, thank you all so very much. We're out of time. We're going to have a short 15-minute break before we go into our next panel, but thanks again. Give it up for our panelists one more time.